Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We start with the Vikings. And before your brain conjures the image of a massive warrior with a horned helmet screaming at the prow of a ship, I need you to know something. That image is wrong in almost every possible way. The horned helmets were not a Viking thing. That was invented by 19th century artists who apparently had very specific opinions about how northern people should look. The real Vikings were something far more interesting, far more complicated, and in many ways far more sophisticated than any film is going to tell you. If you wake up in Viking Age Scandinavia, the first thing you notice is the cold. Not the uncomfortable cold of when the air conditioning is too high, but the kind of cold that has serious intentions. The kind that makes you reconsider your life choices while you're still in bed. And from that very first moment, you already understand something fundamental about Viking society. Everything, absolutely everything, revolves around survival. Not in a dramatic or heroic way, but in a very practical and very organized way. Viking society was divided into three main groups. The Jarls, who were the nobility, the chieftains, the ones who had land and power and probably did not wake up thinking about the cold because they had enough people around them to deal with that. The Carls, who were the free men, the farmers, the craftsmen, the merchants, the backbone of the entire operation. And the Thralls, who were the slaves, a part of Viking society that films tend to omit because it complicates the narrative of the noble free warrior. If you are a Carl, and let's be honest, most people were, your morning does not begin with any kind of motivational speech. It begins with work. The Vikings were fundamentally farmers. Yes, farmers. The image of the warrior who only fights is great for movies, but completely unsustainable as an economic model. You need to eat, you need to feed your family, you need to prepare for a winter that in Scandinavia is not a suggestion, but a real and serious threat. The Viking farm was a complex operation that required the participation of all family members. Children learned from an early age to care for animals, to plant, to harvest, to preserve food. Women managed the household with an authority that in Viking society was recognized and respected. When the man of the house was on an expedition, which could last months or years, the woman took complete control of the property, made economic decisions, negotiated with neighbours and merchants, and kept the family functioning. This was not a society where women waited passively. They were active participants in managing daily life. Viking houses, the longhouses, were long rectangular structures built with wood, stone, or turf depending on the materials available. In Iceland, where timber was scarce, turf houses were the practical solution to the need for insulation in an extreme climate. These constructions could be 20, 30, 40 meters long and served both as family homes and as stables for livestock during the winter months. Yes, the livestock lived inside the house, at the opposite end from the family living area, but inside. Which makes perfect practical sense if you think about it. Now, one thing people do not usually associate with Vikings is that they were extraordinarily clean for their era. This is documented history. Bone and ivory combs are among the objects most frequently found in Viking archaeological excavations. The Anglo-Saxons left written records complaining that the men of the north bathed too frequently, which says quite a lot about the standard of reference they were using. Vikings bathed at least once a week, typically on Saturdays, which in Old Norse was called laugardagr, literally the bath day. That is where the word lördag in modern Swedish for Saturday comes from. So while the rest of medieval Europe was debating whether water was a good idea, the Vikings had a day of the week specifically dedicated to being clean. They had the Althing, an assembly where free men gathered to resolve disputes, establish laws, and make collective decisions. Iceland established its Althing in the year 930, becoming one of the oldest parliaments in the world that continues to function to this day. Think about that for a moment. A democratic institution created by people whom films portray as if the only form of conflict resolution they knew was through axes. Eric the Red was exiled from Norway and then from Iceland for manslaughter. And instead of sitting around lamenting his fate, he decided to explore westward. He found Greenland, called it Greenland, which is a considerably optimistic name for a place that is mostly ice, and convinced enough people to follow him there. His son Leif Erikson went even further. He reached North America around the year 1000, almost 500 years before Columbus, and established a settlement in what is today Newfoundland in Canada. The excavations at Lansoka Meadows have confirmed the Viking presence. The Vikings reached North America. They simply did not stay, probably because the local native peoples had fairly firm opinions about the situation, and the Vikings, being pragmatic, decided it was not worth the permanent conflict. Viking trade routes extended from Scandinavia to Baghdad. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Vikings navigating Russian rivers reached Constantinople and the Islamic world. Arab coins found in archaeological excavations in Scandinavia are direct evidence of that trade. The Varangian Guard, the elite corps of the Byzantine Empire's army, was composed primarily of Scandinavian warriors, personal bodyguards of the Emperor of Constantinople. The most powerful man in the Christian world of the era was protected by Vikings. The Norse mythology deserves its own moment. The Yggdrasil, the world tree connecting the 9 worlds. Ragnarok, the inevitable end of the gods themselves. This is not a mythology that promises eternity and victory. It is a mythology that accepts that everything ends, even the gods, and that what matters is how you behave, knowing that the end will come. Odin himself knew he would die at Ragnarok devoured by the wolf Fenrir, and he kept going anyway. There is something in that worldview that speaks of a people who understood the world in very direct terms, and without self-deception. The sagas, the Norse literary tradition, is one of the richest literary traditions of medieval Europe. Njál's saga, the saga of the Ynglings, Egil's saga, these are serious literary works with 3-dimensional characters and plots that are still studied in universities today. The characters in the sagas lie, make mistakes, have complex and contradictory motivations, and the narrator rarely judges them directly. It is a form of writing that seems surprisingly modern. The decline of the Viking Age was not dramatic or sudden, it was gradual. The last major Viking expedition was Harald Hardrada's in 1066, which ended in his death at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in England, a few weeks before William the Conqueror, who also had Viking Norman blood in his veins, changed the history of England at Hastings. That is one of the most remarkable coincidences of medieval history. The last Viking expedition and the Norman invasion of England occurring in the same year, 3 weeks apart. From the frozen shores of Scandinavia we move now to the heart of the Roman Empire, specifically the city of Rome at its peak, around the 1st and 2nd century of our era. And here too, as with the Vikings, what follows is going to be considerably more interesting, stranger, and in some moments more disturbing than any history class prepared you to expect. If you wake up in 1st century Rome, the first thing you need to know is that Rome was the largest city in the world. 1 million people in a relatively compact space, creating an urban density that would not be seen again in the Western world until well into the 19th century. And that density created problems that the Romans solved with varying degrees of success, and in some cases with solutions that are difficult to classify as such. Traffic, for example. Rome had a traffic problem so severe that Julius Caesar implemented regulations prohibiting the circulation of carts and wagons in the city centre during daytime hours, which meant that all the heavy transport of goods was done at night, which in turn meant that the inhabitants of Rome slept with the constant noise of carts, oxen, and carters with very firm opinions about the situation. The poet Juvenal complained extensively about the impossibility of sleeping in the city. So if you are listening to this to sleep and feel a certain historical solidarity with the situation, know that 1st century Romans would understand you perfectly. The streets of Rome were narrow, irregular, and constantly congested during daylight hours. Pedestrians shared that space with street vendors, craftsmen working in front of their shops, animals being led to market, and occasionally religious or military processions that blocked traffic even more effectively. The result was the organized chaos that characterized Roman urban life, and that any modern city dweller would recognize as fundamentally similar to what they experienced during rush hour. The insulae were the apartment buildings where most of the urban Roman population lived. The name literally means islands. They could reach 6, 7, or 8 stories in height, which made them structurally problematic. The upper floors were the cheapest because they were furthest from the water, hardest to evacuate in case of fire, and the ones that collapsed first when the structure gave way. The lower floors were the most expensive and most inhabited by people with resources. Conditions in the insulae could vary enormously. Some were well built and maintained by responsible owners. Others were fire traps waiting to burn, constructed with cheap materials, overcrowded with tenants. Water was one of Rome's great achievements. Rome had 11 main aqueducts that brought approximately 1 million cubic meters of water to the city each day. That is an extraordinary amount of clean water for a city of 1 million people. There were public fountains in every neighborhood. There were public baths, the thermae, where citizens could bathe, socialize, exercise, conduct business. The thermae were not simply a place to wash. They were the social center of Roman urban life. They had pools of hot, warm, and cold water. They had exercise areas. They had libraries in some cases. They had gardens. They had food and drink shops. The baths of Caracalla could accommodate 1,600 people simultaneously. Think about that for a moment. 1,600 people in a public bath complex. And yet, at the same time, Rome had a sewage problem that was less elegant. The apartment buildings generally had no direct connection to the sewer system, which meant that residents of the upper floors either had to descend several flights to the communal facilities or use vessels that were then emptied in the most convenient way available. There was a Latin phrase that basically advised people to look up when walking under balconies, and the fact that this phrase existed as practical advice tells you everything you need to know about the degree to which the regulations were followed in daily practice. Rome was a city of monumental glory and completely ordinary sanitation problems. Like practically every city in history, if we are honest, the gladiators deserve a separate moment because the popular image is partially correct and broadly distorted. Gladiatorial combats were real, but the idea that combats invariably ended with the death of the loser is statistically inaccurate. Gladiators were expensive investments. Training them required considerable time, money, and resources. Historical sources suggest that most combats did not end in death. The defeated gladiator could ask for mercy, and the person financing the spectacle made the decision based on the opinion of the crowd and practical considerations. And frequently, the losing gladiator was pardoned to fight another day. There were veteran gladiators who survived many combats, who gained fame and something resembling celebrity, who could eventually obtain freedom if they were slaves, or simply retire if they were free. The Roman law is perhaps the most enduring legacy of that entire civilization. The legal principles developed by the Romans, the presumption of innocence, the right to present a defense, the distinction between public and private law, the systematic codification of laws, form the basis of the legal systems of most European countries and many others in the world. When you go to a court in Spain, France, Argentina, or Mexico, you are interacting with a system that has direct roots in that set of laws developed by people who lived in insulae with sewage problems and complained about not being able to sleep because of the noise of the night traffic. There is something profoundly human in that continuity. The emperors are a gallery of personalities that make contemporary politics seem boring by comparison. Augustus I, who understood that power in Rome worked better when it did not appear monarchical, even though it functioned exactly like a monarchy. Caligula, about whom the stories are so extreme that historians have spent centuries debating what is true and what is later propaganda, though even the moderate versions are quite disturbing. Claudius, whom everyone expected to be a weak and ineffective ruler, and who turned out to be one of the most competent administrators in Roman imperial history. Nero, who started his reign with considerable promise, and ended it so catastrophically that the Senate declared him a public enemy and he committed suicide to avoid execution. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the year 476 was not the dramatic and sudden event sometimes imagined. It was the endpoint of a process of centuries, gradual, complex, multifactorial. Rome did not fall, it transformed. The law, the Latin language which transformed into the Romance languages we speak today, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, Romanian, the physical infrastructure, the aqueducts, the roads, many of which continued being used for centuries after the empire that built them had ceased to exist. And the Catholic Church, which adopted the Roman administrative structure, Latin as its liturgical language, and in many ways functioned as a continuation of the Roman apparatus in the post-Roman world, because the story of how something powerful transforms into something different but equally enduring is perhaps the most important story ancient Rome has to tell us. From imperial Rome we arrive now at a figure who in some ways has more in common with the Viking explorers and the pragmatic Romans than might appear at first glance. We arrive at Nikola Tesla, a man who saw things no one else could see, who understood forces that most of his contemporaries were barely beginning to intuit, and who spent his life building the world we live in while that world did everything it could to forget he had existed. Nikola Tesla was born in 1856 in Smiljan, a village in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire and is today Croatia. From childhood, his relationship with the world was different. Not different in the vague and romantic sense applied to geniuses retrospectively, but different in specific and verifiable ways. He saw flashes of light, vivid images that appeared without warning in his visual field. He could visualize objects in 3 dimensions in his mind with such precision that he did not need to make physical prototypes to test his designs. He could build a machine completely in his head, run it mentally, identify the problems, adjust the components, and arrive at a solution, all without touching a piece of paper or a tool. For Tesla, the design process was purely mental. The physical was simply the materialization of something that already existed complete in his imagination. His father was a Serbian Orthodox priest who wanted Nikola to follow a religious career. Nikola had other plans. There is a story, probably true because Tesla told it himself, that when he was a boy and saw lightning during a storm, he felt no fear, he felt curiosity. While everyone else ran for shelter, he was looking at the sky thinking about what exactly that phenomenon was and how it could be harnessed. That difference, that instinctive response to the world as a problem to solve rather than a danger to flee, defines well who Tesla was. Direct current, the electrical system that Thomas Edison had developed and promoted with enormous commercial success, had a fundamental limitation. It could not be transmitted efficiently over long distances. Energy was lost in the process. This meant that to electrify a city using direct current, you needed generating stations every few kilometers. It was expensive, inefficient, and scaled poorly. Tesla saw it with perfect clarity. Alternating current could travel much greater distances without losing efficiency. It was the solution, Tesla knew it, and no one wanted to listen to him because Edison had already bet on direct current, and Edison was the most famous inventor in the world. Tesla arrived in the United States in 1884 with a letter of recommendation for Edison, and at first it seemed like the perfect match. But beneath the surface something was not right. Edison was practical, business-minded, focused on what worked now. Tesla was a visionary. He was not interested in small improvements. He wanted a complete overhaul. And that difference created tension. Edison reportedly promised Tesla a large financial reward for improving his DC generators. Tesla worked tirelessly, delivered results, and when he asked for the payment, Edison laughed it off as a joke. Tesla left. No safety net, no stable income, just his ideas. For a time things got rough. Tesla, the man who could design entire electrical systems in his mind, found himself digging ditches just to survive. A genius reduced to manual labor. George Westinghouse gave him the opportunity he needed. The war of currents. The public battle between Edison's system and that of Tesla and Westinghouse is one of the most extraordinary episodes in the history of technology. Edison organized public demonstrations where animals were electrocuted using alternating current to prove how dangerous it was. Alternating current was used in the first electric chair precisely so the public would associate it with death. It was a marketing campaign based on fear, and it worked for a time, but then came the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. 100,000 electric lights illuminating the fairgrounds using alternating current. A demonstration of stability, of control, of possibility that was impossible to ignore. The war of currents was effectively decided. Every outlet in your wall, every phone charger, every appliance, every factory and hospital and subway station, everything runs on the system that Tesla designed in his head decades before the infrastructure to implement it existed. And yet Tesla died in 1943, alone, in a room at the Hotel New Yorker in Manhattan, practically in poverty and largely forgotten by the general public. When Westinghouse found himself in financial difficulties, Tesla voluntarily relinquished his royalties, the percentage he was entitled to collect for every unit of energy generated using his patents. He did it because Westinghouse had given him his opportunity when no one else would, because he believed that the alternating current system should continue expanding, and because ultimately Tesla valued the extension of his technology more than the money it could generate. It was an act of generosity, or idealism, or both simultaneously, that cost him the fortune that would otherwise have been his. His most ambitious project was the Wardenclyffe Tower, an enormous structure built on Long Island. The idea was to create a global system of wireless transmission of energy and information, free for everyone. That last part was the problem. Morgan withdrew the funding when it became clear that Tesla's vision was not simply to improve communications, but to create a system of free global energy. If energy could be sent freely through the air, there was no way to charge for it, no business model, no return on investment. The tower was finally demolished in 1917 to pay debts. Tesla saw the symbol of his greatest dream physically disappear. In his final years, Tesla lived in the Hotel New Yorker, whose management allowed him to stay despite the debts he accumulated. He fed pigeons in Bryant Park. He had an intense and well-documented relationship with a white pigeon he described as if she were his closest companion. He died on January 7th, 1943. An FBI agent confiscated his papers immediately afterwards. The posthumous recognition has been more generous than the contemporary. The unit of magnetic flux density in the international system bears his name, the Tesla unit. His name also appears on the logo of an electric car company whose founders understood the symbolic value of associating with someone who was simultaneously the father of modern electricity and the person who best illustrates the contradictions between contribution to human progress and the material reward that progress generates. The Viking ships deserve a separate moment because they are genuinely extraordinary from a technological perspective. The Draka, the longship, was a masterpiece of naval engineering that allowed things that other ships of the era simply could not do. They had a very shallow draft, which meant they could navigate in very shallow water, even in rivers, which was an enormous tactical advantage. They could approach shores where heavier ships of other cultures simply could not reach, and they could be taken out of the water and transported overland if the situation required it. Imagine the logistics of transporting a 10-meter ship overland. The Vikings did it when they needed to. The construction of these ships was an art in itself. The clinker technique was used, overlapping wooden planks with a slight overlap rather than placing them edge to edge, which created a flexible structure that absorbed the movement of the sea rather than rigidly resisting it. This made Viking ships extraordinarily resistant in open water. They could cross the North Atlantic, one of the most hostile bodies of water on the planet, in vessels that from a modern perspective would seem alarmingly small for such an undertaking. Viking navigation was based on a combination of astronomical observation, knowledge of currents and winds, and accumulated experience passed down from generation to generation. They used the stars when visible. They observed the behavior of birds, which could indicate the proximity of land. They had rudimentary instruments for measuring the position of the sun, and they had something historians call the sunstone, an instrument that may have allowed determining the position of the sun even in overcast conditions. What is not debated is that the Vikings navigated extraordinarily long routes with remarkable precision and arrived where they wanted to go. The livestock was fundamental to Viking daily life: cows, sheep, goats. Not because Vikings were particularly sentimentally attached to farm animals, but because in a Scandinavian winter, having livestock is the difference between surviving and not surviving. The meat, the milk, the wool, the leather, everything comes from there. And caring for that livestock is not a minor task. It is a daily, constant responsibility that does not take days off, and definitely does not wait for you to finish your morning coffee. Viking houses, the longhouses, had the central fire as their heart. There was no chimney in the modern sense. Smoke escaped through an opening in the roof, or simply accumulated in the upper part of the space before slowly escaping. This meant that the people who lived in these houses regularly breathed air mixed with smoke, which had consequences for pulmonary health that modern analysis of skeletal remains has been able to confirm. It was the price to pay for warmth, and in Scandinavia, warmth was not a luxury. It was a survival necessity. The food deserves attention too. Viking bread was made with rye, barley, or oats depending on what was available. Wheat was relatively rare in Scandinavia because the climate did not favour its cultivation, so Viking breads tended to be denser, darker, and more nutritious than the white wheat bread associated with modern baking. Sky, a fermented dairy product that is essentially the ancestor of modern Icelandic yogurt, was an important source of protein and could be preserved for reasonable periods, making it valuable for travel and expeditions. Fish was omnipresent, especially herring and cod, which was dried or salted for preservation. Dried cod, the scray, could be preserved for months or years without refrigeration, making it the perfect food for long sea voyages. Beer and mead were the main beverages. Water was not always safe to drink, so fermented beverages served a practical function as well as a social one. The mead hall, the great communal drinking and feasting space, was fundamental in Viking culture. It was the meeting place, the celebration space, the storytelling venue. The Skald, the Viking poet, recited his verses in these spaces. The deeds of ancestors were recounted. Community bonds were strengthened. It was not simply drinking, it was building the collective identity of a group of people around a shared story. Disputes at the Althing could be resolved through economic compensation. The concept of wergild, which was basically the price of a person, a compensation paid to the family of someone who had been killed to prevent a vendetta that could escalate indefinitely. The wergild had specific tables. A free man had a price. A jarl had a higher price. A thrall had a different price. It was a system that might seem cold in modern moral terms, but that worked efficiently to cut the cycles of revenge that could otherwise destroy families and entire communities for generations. Sometimes disputes were resolved through the duel, the holmgang, a formal combat with specific rules about where it took place, what weapons were used, and how the outcome was determined. The holmgang was not simply a fight. It was a legal procedure with referees, rules of conduct, and formal consequences for anyone who refused to participate. Refusing a holmgang had severe social consequences that could amount to a form of permanent public dishonor. Odin is particularly fascinating as a divine figure because he is the least reassuring of gods that a society could worship. He is the god of war, yes, but also of wisdom, of magic, of poetry, of death. He is the god who sacrificed his own eye to drink from the well of wisdom. He is the god who hung from the Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, wounded by his own spear, to discover the secret of the runes. He is a god who constantly seeks knowledge and power to prepare for a battle he knows he will lose. That is not the image of a victorious god. It is the image of someone who understands that defeat is possible and prepares with everything he has anyway. Thor, the god of thunder, is in many ways the opposite of his father Odin. Where Odin is complex, calculating, and morally ambiguous, Thor is direct, loyal, and physically imposing. He is the protector of humans against the giants, the one who carries the hammer Mjolnir and strikes with it when the giants threaten to break the order of the world. Thor is popular in Viking society not because he is the most powerful or wisest god, but because he is the most understandable. He is the ideal warrior, the defender of the community, the one who does not abandon his post. Freya, the goddess of love and war, received half of the warriors fallen in battle. The other half went to Odin in Valhalla. This division of the harvest of death, so to speak, says something interesting about Norse theology. There is not a single realm of heroic dead. There are at least 2, and one of them is governed by a goddess who is also the deity of love and fertility. Death and love and renewal are connected in Norse mythology in ways that make it more complex and more interesting than a superficial reading suggests. The runes, the Viking writing system, had both a practical and a magical function. Practically, they were used to mark objects, for inscriptions on stone commemorating events or people, for written communication when necessary. But they were also used in magical rituals to create amulets, to predict the future. Runic magic was a serious practice in Viking society, something that skalds and ritual specialists knew and practiced. It was not what moderns tend to classify as superstition separate from real life. It was an integral part of the Norse worldview, where the material world and the spiritual world were constantly interacting. Women in Viking society had a relatively high status compared to other contemporary medieval cultures. They could own property, could divorce, could inherit, could participate in commerce. A Viking woman whose husband was absent on an expedition had complete authority over the farm, economic decisions, household management. The excavations have found some women buried with objects suggesting leadership roles or high status, including the famous Osberg burial in Norway, where two high-status women were buried in an elaborately decorated ship with textiles, carts, sleds, and a funerary trousseau of extraordinary wealth. From the frozen shores of Scandinavia, we move now to the heart of the Roman Empire, specifically the city of Rome at its peak, around the 1st and 2nd century of our era. And here too, as with the Vikings, what follows is going to be considerably more interesting, stranger, and in some moments more disturbing than any history class prepared you to expect. If you wake up in 1st century Rome, the first thing you need to know is that Rome was the largest city in the world. 1 million people in a relatively compact space, creating an urban density that would not be seen again in the Western world until well into the 19th century. And that density created problems that the Romans solved with varying degrees of success, and in some cases with solutions that are difficult to classify as such. Traffic, for example. Rome had a traffic problem so severe that Julius Caesar implemented regulations prohibiting the circulation of carts and wagons in the city centre during daytime hours, which meant that all the heavy transport of goods was done at night, which in turn meant that the inhabitants of Rome slept with the constant noise of carts, oxen and carters, with very firm opinions about the situation. The poet Juvenal complained extensively about the impossibility of sleeping in the city. So if you are listening to this to sleep and feel a certain historical solidarity with the situation, know that 1st century Romans would understand you perfectly. The streets of Rome were narrow, irregular, and constantly congested during daylight hours. Pedestrians shared that space with street vendors, craftsmen working in front of their shops, animals being led to market, and occasionally religious or military processions that blocked traffic even more effectively. Signage was minimal, traffic rules were ambiguous. The result was the organized chaos that characterized Roman urban life, and that any modern city dweller would recognize as fundamentally similar to what they experienced during rush hour. The insulae were the apartment buildings where most of the urban Roman population lived. The name literally means islands, and the metaphor was appropriate because these multi-story buildings were surrounded by streets on all sides like islands in an urban sea. They could reach 6, 7, or 8 stories in height, which made them structurally problematic given that Roman concrete, while extraordinarily durable, had limits in terms of the height it could support without compromising structural integrity. The upper floors were the cheapest because they were furthest from the water, hardest to evacuate in case of fire, and the ones that collapsed first when the structure gave way. The lower floors were the most expensive and most inhabited by people with resources. Conditions in the insulae could vary enormously. Some were well built, had reasonable access to water, and were maintained by responsible owners. Others were fire traps waiting to burn, constructed with cheap materials, overcrowded with tenants, and maintained with the minimum possible investment. Fires were a constant and frequent risk. Rome burned on multiple occasions throughout its history, and every time it burned, the reconstruction process was an opportunity both for improvement and for real estate speculation. Owners of insulae in 1st century Rome were not exactly known for their altruism. Water was one of Rome's great achievements and one of the most revealing elements about how Roman society functioned. Rome had 11 main aqueducts that brought approximately 1 million cubic meters of water to the city each day. That is an extraordinary amount of clean water for a city of 1 million people. There were public fountains in every neighborhood. There were public baths, the thermae where citizens could bathe, socialize, exercise, conduct business. The thermae were not simply a place to wash, they were the social centre of Roman urban life. They had pools of hot, warm and cold water. They had exercise areas, the palaestrae, where men practiced wrestling, weightlifting and other exercises. They had libraries in some cases. They had gardens. They had food and drink shops. They had conversation rooms where citizens of all social strata could interact in a relatively egalitarian environment. The entrance fee was minimal or free, subsidized by the public treasury or by donations from wealthy citizens seeking to gain popular favor. The baths of Caracalla, built in the early 3rd century, could accommodate 1,600 people simultaneously. Think about that for a moment. 1,600 people in a public bath complex. The building covered more than 11 hectares. It had indoor pools and facilities that today we would classify as a complete sports centre. It functioned as a democratic space where the humblest citizen could use the same facilities as the richest, though probably not at the same hours or with the same degree of privilege in terms of access to the best areas. And yet, at the same time, Rome had a sewage problem that was less elegant. The Cloaca Maxima, the sewer system, was impressive for its era. But the apartment buildings, the insulae, where most ordinary people lived, generally had no direct connection to that system, which meant that residents of the upper floors either had to descend several flights to the communal facilities or use vessels that were then emptied in the most convenient way available. There was a Latin phrase that basically advised people to look up when walking under balconies, and the fact that this phrase existed as practical advice tells you everything you need to know about the degree to which those regulations were followed in daily practice. Rome was a city of monumental glory and completely ordinary sanitation problems. Like practically every city in history, if we are honest. The Roman system of classes was more complex and more fluid than generally taught. The patricians, the original aristocratic families, the plebeians, the rest of the free citizens, the equites, the equestrian class, which was basically the commercial and administrative class, the freedmen, slaves who had been manumitted and obtained freedom, who in Rome could reach positions of considerable importance, and the slaves, who made up between 25 and 30% of the Roman population, a proportion with enormous implications for understanding how the Roman economy and society functioned. Roman slavery was a complex institution, which does not make it morally more acceptable, but does make it harder to understand if you oversimplify it. There were domestic slaves in wealthy households who had a considerably better life than many free poor citizens. There were slaves who worked in the mines, which was possibly the worst imaginable situation, and from which few people ever emerged. There were educated slaves, doctors, teachers, administrators, who were essentially professionals who simply were not free. Many slaves were eventually manumitted, freed, and freedmen could become Roman citizens with full rights. The system had mechanisms of social mobility that distinguished it from later forms of slavery, which does not make it less brutal, but does make it more nuanced than usually presented. The gladiators deserve a separate moment because the popular image is, like so many things Roman, partially correct and broadly distorted. Gladiatorial combats were real. The Colosseum, inaugurated in the year 80 of our era under Emperor Titus, was the site of thousands of these events over the centuries. But the idea that combats invariably ended with the death of the loser is statistically inaccurate. Gladiators were expensive investments. Training them required considerable time, money, and resources. Historical sources suggest that most combats did not end in death. The defeated gladiator could ask for mercy by raising a finger, and the editor of the games made the decision based on the opinion of the crowd and practical considerations, and frequently the losing gladiator was pardoned to fight another day. There were different types of gladiators with different armaments, different fighting styles, and different statuses. The retiarius, who used net and trident, against the murmillo, who had shield and gladius. The hoplomachus, with Greek-inspired equipment, The secutor, specifically designed to fight against the retiarius. It was a kind of violent theatre with specialized categories and fans who preferred some types over others. The amphitheatre served multiple social functions. It was entertainment, yes, but also politics. The emperors and politicians who financed games were buying popular favour in the most direct way possible. The phrase bread and circuses, attributed to the poet Juvenal, captures something real about how Roman power kept the urban population happy. Free food, through subsidized grain distributions and public spectacles. It is a strategy that has a perfectly understandable political logic, even if morally questionable. Food in Rome was another world of complexity. For the elite, the banquets, the convivia, were social events of considerable elaboration. Roman writers have left us descriptions of banquets lasting hours, with multiple courses, entertainment, philosophical conversation, and quantities of wine that would render any modern person unaccustomed to it unconscious. Roman wine was typically drunk mixed with water, and sometimes with spices and other additives. Drinking it pure was considered a sign of barbarism or serious problems with alcohol. For ordinary people, the diet was more modest. Garum, a fermented fish sauce that was the universal condiment of Roman cooking, was in everything, in soups, in meats, in vegetables. The archaeology of Pompeii has given us an extraordinarily detailed picture of Roman daily life. And what we find in Pompeii is that most people ate primarily at the thermopolia, the fast food establishments of the era. Marble counters with built-in containers to keep food warm, quick service, reasonable prices. Rome burned frequently. The Great Fire of Rome of the year 64 of our era, the one popularly associated with Nero playing the violin while the city burned, which is a historically impossible image because the violin did not exist in the 1st century, destroyed much of the city. Nero used the destruction to rebuild Rome in a more planned way and to construct his palace, the Domus Aurea or Golden House, in the space freed by the fire, which earned him a reputation that did not exactly improve his public image. The emperors are a gallery of personalities that make contemporary politics seem boring by comparison. Augustus I, who understood that power in Rome worked better when it did not appear monarchical, even though it functioned exactly like a monarchy. Tiberius, his successor, who retired to the island of Capri and governed the empire largely by correspondence. Caligula, about whom the stories are so extreme that historians have spent centuries debating what is true and what is later propaganda, though even the moderate versions are quite disturbing. Claudius, whom everyone expected to be a weak and ineffective ruler, and who turned out to be one of the most competent administrators in Roman imperial history. Nero, who started his reign with considerable promise and ended it so catastrophically that the Senate declared him a public enemy and he committed suicide to avoid execution. The Roman law is perhaps the most enduring legacy of that entire civilization. The legal principles developed by the Romans, the presumption of innocence, the right to present a defense, the distinction between public and private law, the systematic codification of laws, form the basis of the legal systems of most European countries and many others in the world. The Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian, is the foundation of the civil law we use today. When you go to a court in Spain, France, Argentina, or Mexico, you are interacting with a system that has direct roots in that set of laws developed by people who lived in insulae with sewage problems and complained about not being able to sleep because of the noise of the night traffic. There is something profoundly human in that continuity. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the year 476 was not the dramatic and sudden event sometimes imagined. It was the endpoint of a process of centuries, gradual, complex, multifactorial. The barbarian invasions were real, but the barbarians had been integrated into the Roman army for centuries. The economic crisis was real, but had deep roots in structures that had worked for centuries and stopped working. The administrative division between the Western and Eastern Empire created dynamics that benefited Constantinople, while Rome lost centrality. And the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, continued for almost another 1,000 years until 1453, which means the end of Rome was not as definitive as the date 476 suggests. What remained when the Western Empire fragmented was precisely what was mentioned before: the law, the language, Latin, which transformed into the Romance languages we speak today, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, Romanian, the physical infrastructure, the aqueducts, the roads, many of which continued being used for centuries after the empire that built them had ceased to exist, and the Catholic Church, which adopted the Roman administrative structure, Latin as its liturgical language, and in many ways functioned as a continuation of the Roman apparatus in the post-Roman world. Rome did not fall, it transformed. And that transformation is as fascinating as any of the stories of eccentric emperors, or surviving gladiators, or endless banquets with elaborate culinary tricks. The Roman Forum was the beating heart of the city. Not just a marketplace, though it was that too, but the center of political, religious, and commercial life simultaneously. Imagine a space where you could walk past the Temple of Saturn, which housed the state treasury, turn a corner and find yourself in front of the rostra, the platform from which politicians addressed the crowd, and then a few steps later be negotiating a business deal with a merchant who had travelled from the eastern provinces. All of this happening at the same time, in the same space, with the constant background noise of 1 million people living their lives in close proximity. The Roman calendar was another reflection of how deeply organized Roman society was. The Romans did not simply have days and months. They had a complex system of market days, religious festivals, days on which courts could sit and days on which they could not, days favourable for beginning new enterprises, and days when such things were inadvisable. A Roman citizen navigating daily life needed to understand not just what day it was, but what kind of day it was, what activities were permitted, what rituals were required, what obligations were due. The calendar was a social contract embedded in time itself. Roman religion was as practical as everything else in Roman life. The state religion was not primarily about personal salvation or moral transformation. It was about maintaining the proper relationship between Rome and the gods, the pax deorum, the peace of the gods. As long as the proper sacrifices were made, the proper rituals observed, the proper festivals celebrated, the gods would maintain their favourable attitude toward Rome. If something went wrong, if a battle was lost or a plague struck, the first question was not what moral failing had caused it, but what ritual had been neglected or performed incorrectly. This pragmatic approach to religion meant that the Romans were remarkably tolerant of foreign gods and foreign religious practices, as long as those practices did not threaten the social order or require rejection of the Roman state religion. Jews were generally allowed to practice their religion without interference. Eastern mystery cults spread through the empire and attracted followers at all levels of society. The worship of Mithras, a Persian deity associated with soldiers and the military, spread through the legions and had temples across the entire empire. The Romans collected gods the way they collected provinces. The exception was Christianity, at least initially. Not because Christian theology was inherently unacceptable to Roman religious sensibility, but because Christians refused to participate in the state religion, refused to offer sacrifices to the emperor's genius, and refused to acknowledge any authority above their own god. In a system where religious participation was a civic duty and the emperor's divine status was a political necessity, that refusal was not simply heresy, it was a form of political non-compliance. The persecutions of early Christians, which were real, but often exaggerated in popular imagination, were primarily about political loyalty rather than theological disagreement. Roman medicine was considerably more sophisticated than its reputation suggests. Roman physicians, many of whom were Greek by origin or training, had a detailed knowledge of anatomy, pharmacology, and surgical technique. Military medicine was particularly advanced, driven by the practical necessity of keeping soldiers functional. Roman military camps had hospitals, the valetudinaria, with dedicated medical staff. Wounded soldiers received systematic treatment rather than simply being left to recover or die. The survival rates for certain types of wounds were higher in the Roman legions than in many later medieval armies, precisely because of this organized medical care. Galen of Pergamon, the most influential physician of the Roman imperial period, wrote extensively on anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, and clinical practice. His work dominated Western medicine for over 1,000 years after his death. He was court physician to Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and had the opportunity to conduct anatomical research on a scale that would not be matched until the Renaissance. His understanding of the circulatory system, while not entirely correct by modern standards, was a significant advance over what had come before, and his systematic approach to observation and documentation of clinical cases established patterns of medical reasoning that are still recognizable in modern clinical practice. The Roman army deserves attention because it was one of the most sophisticated military organizations in the ancient world, and also one of the most powerful engines of cultural transmission. The legions were not simply fighting forces. They were construction teams, road builders, bridge engineers, surveyors. When a Roman legion moved into a new territory, it built a fortified camp according to a standardized plan. Every legionary knew exactly where the commander's tent was, where the hospital was, where the latrines were, regardless of which legion he served in or where that legion was stationed. The standardization was total, and it worked. The roads that the legions built are perhaps their most visible legacy. Roman roads were not simply paths made hard, they were engineered surfaces with drainage ditches, gravel foundations, and stone paving designed to carry heavy loads in all weather conditions. The phrase "all roads lead to Rome" was not simply a metaphor. It was a description of a real network of approximately 80,000 kilometers of paved road that connected every corner of the empire to the capital. These roads were so well built that many of them continued to be used as primary routes for travel and commerce for centuries after the empire that built them had ceased to exist. Some of them are still visible today, still fundamentally intact, still following the straight lines that Roman surveyors traced across the landscape 2,000 years ago. The legions also served as vectors of cultural exchange. A soldier recruited in Britain might serve in Egypt. A Syrian auxiliary might find himself stationed on the Rhine frontier. The movement of people, ideas, technologies, and goods that the military generated was one of the great engines of cultural mixing in the ancient world. Latin spread not just through administrative necessity, but through the social networks created by military service. Veterans who retired settled in the provinces where they had served, married local women, raised children who were Roman citizens by law, and often culturally mixed in practice. The Roman economy was far more complex and far more integrated than the simple picture of conquest and tribute suggests. There was large-scale manufacturing. There was long-distance trade in goods ranging from British tin to Indian spices to Chinese silk. There were financial instruments, contracts, partnerships, forms of credit that would be recognizable to a modern economist. The workshops of Arretium in central Italy produced standardized pottery that was exported throughout the empire. Gaul produced wine and olive oil for export. North Africa supplied grain. The British Isles supplied metals. Each region specialized in what it could produce most efficiently and traded for what it could not. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled from 161 to 180, represents perhaps the closest thing to Plato's philosopher king that history actually produced. He was a committed Stoic philosopher who continued to write his philosophical meditations, while managing an empire under constant military pressure from Germanic tribes in the north and Parthians in the east. His meditations were never intended for publication. They were private notes to himself, reminders of Stoic principles he was trying to live by, observations on the difficulty of maintaining philosophical equanimity while exercising imperial power. They have survived and are still read today because they capture something genuinely true about the difficulty of trying to be a good person while also being a powerful one. Marcus Aurelius knew that power corrupted. He spent his reign trying not to let it corrupt him. Whether he succeeded is a matter of historical debate, but the effort itself is remarkable. The Stoic philosophy that Marcus Aurelius practiced was in many ways the most Roman of the Greek philosophical schools. It emphasized duty, self-control, acceptance of what cannot be changed, and the performance of one's role in the larger social order. These were values that Roman aristocratic culture already recognized and honored. Stoicism gave them a philosophical framework and a set of practices, meditation, journaling, daily review of one's actions, that made those values accessible as a systematic way of life rather than simply as cultural expectations. The decline of the empire was accompanied by a flowering of religious experimentation that is one of the most fascinating periods in Western religious history. The 3rd century in particular saw an extraordinary proliferation of mystery cults, philosophical religions, and new theological ideas competing for the allegiance of a population that was increasingly anxious about the political instability and economic disruption of that era. Neoplatonism, developed by Plotinus and his successors, offered a sophisticated philosophical alternative to both traditional polytheism and the emerging Christian movement. Manichaeism, founded by the Persian prophet Mani, spread rapidly through the empire and beyond, offering a dualistic cosmology that explained the problem of evil in ways that many people found compelling. Christianity ultimately prevailed in this competition not simply because it was theologically superior, but because it had organizational advantages that its competitors lacked. The Church created networks of mutual support that were practically useful in an era of instability. It developed a hierarchical structure that allowed coordination across vast distances. It produced texts that could be copied and distributed, and it made conversion accessible to people of all social classes and both sexes in ways that some of its competitors did not. The Emperor Constantine's conversion in the early 4th century accelerated the process, but Christianity had already become a major force in Roman society before Constantine. His conversion recognized a reality rather than creating one. From imperial Rome we arrive now at a figure who in some ways has more in common with the Viking explorers and the pragmatic Romans than might appear at first glance. We arrive at Nikola Tesla, a man who saw things no one else could see, who understood forces that most of his contemporaries were barely beginning to intuit, and who spent his life building the world we live in, while that world did everything it could to forget he had existed. Nikola Tesla was born in 1856 in Smiljan, a village in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire and is today Croatia. From childhood, his relationship with the world was different. Not different in the vague and romantic sense applied to geniuses retrospectively, but different in specific and verifiable ways. He saw flashes of light, vivid images that appeared without warning in his visual field. He could visualize objects in 3 dimensions in his mind, with such precision that he did not need to make physical prototypes to test his designs. He could build a machine completely in his head, run it mentally, identify the problems, adjust the components, and arrive at a solution, all without touching a piece of paper or a tool. For Tesla, the design process was purely mental. The physical was simply the materialization of something that already existed, complete in his imagination. His father was a Serbian Orthodox priest who wanted Nikola to follow a religious career. Nikola had other plans. From a very young age, he was obsessed with electricity, with energy, with the invisible forces that could make the world function in ways no one yet completely understood. There is a story, probably true because Tesla told it himself, that when he was a boy and saw lightning during a storm, he felt no fear. He felt curiosity. While everyone else ran for shelter, he was looking at the sky, thinking about what exactly that phenomenon was and how it could be harnessed. That difference, that instinctive response to the world as a problem to solve, rather than a danger to flee, defines well who Tesla was. As a student, Tesla became obsessed with electricity, not just as a subject, but as a force that could reshape the entire world. While others memorized formulas and passed exams, Tesla went deeper. He did not just want to understand how things worked, he wanted to improve them. And that is where the problem began. Direct current, the electrical system that Thomas Edison had developed and promoted with enormous commercial success, had a fundamental limitation. It could not be transmitted efficiently over long distances. Energy was lost in the process. This meant that to electrify a city using direct current, you needed generating stations every few kilometers. It was expensive, inefficient, and scaled poorly. Tesla saw it with perfect clarity. Alternating current, in which the direction of the current flow changes rapidly in regular cycles, could travel much greater distances without losing efficiency. It could be transmitted at high voltage and then reduced at points of use via transformers. It was the solution. Tesla knew it. And no one wanted to listen to him because Edison had already bet on direct current, and Edison was the most famous inventor in the world. Tesla pushed himself relentlessly, studying for hours without rest, diving deeper into concepts that most people barely understood. At one point he claimed he could work for days without sleep, which sounds impressive until you realize it is also a warning sign. Because Tesla did not just think differently, he lived differently. His mind was always running, always solving, always chasing the next idea. And while that gave him an incredible advantage, it also made him difficult to relate to. Professors doubted him. Peers did not fully understand him. His ideas were often dismissed as unrealistic. But Tesla did not stop. If anything, the resistance fueled him because in his mind, the answer was already clear. He could see it perfectly, completely. The system worked, the machines functioned, the world powered by alternating current already existed, at least inside his head. Now he just had to prove it to everyone else. Tesla arrived in the United States in 1884 with little more than a letter of recommendation and a mind full of ideas. He came with a single goal: to work for Thomas Edison. If Tesla's ideas were going to become reality, this was where it would happen. And at first it seemed like the perfect match. Tesla joined Edison's company and immediately began working on improving his electrical systems. He worked long hours solving complex problems, redesigning inefficient machines, pushing himself even harder than before. But beneath the surface, something was not right. Because Tesla and Edison were not just different, they were opposites. Edison was practical, business-minded, focused on what worked now. He believed in direct current, the system he had already invested in, built infrastructure around, and was making money from. Tesla was a visionary. He was not interested in small improvements. He wanted a complete overhaul. Alternating current was not just better in his eyes. It was inevitable. And that difference created tension. There is a famous story that Edison once promised Tesla a large financial reward if he could improve his DC generators. Tesla worked tirelessly, delivered results, and when he asked for the promised payment, Edison reportedly laughed it off as a joke. Whether it happened exactly like that or not, the outcome was clear. Tesla felt betrayed, and soon after he left, no safety net, no stable income, just his ideas and the growing realization that brilliance alone was not enough in a world driven by profit. For a time things got rough. Tesla, the man who could design entire electrical systems in his mind, found himself digging ditches just to survive. A genius reduced to manual labor. But here is what is important. He did not give up. Because even in that moment, even at his lowest point, Tesla still believed in one thing. Alternating current would change the world. And he was about to find someone willing to take that bet. George Westinghouse gave him the opportunity he needed. Westinghouse was a businessman who understood the commercial potential of alternating current and who recognized in Tesla someone who could make it work. He understood what Tesla had been trying to prove all along, that alternating current could travel farther, power entire cities, and do it more efficiently than anything else available. So he backed him. And just like that, Tesla went from struggling inventor to the center of one of the most intense technological rivalries in history, the war of currents. On one side, Edison and direct current, already established, already funded, already in use. On the other, Tesla and Westinghouse, pushing a system that was newer, more complex, and far more powerful. But this was not just a debate about engineering, it was a battle for the future, because whoever won would not just dominate the industry, they would define how electricity would be used across the entire world. And Edison was not about to lose. He launched a campaign to discredit alternating current. Public demonstrations were staged where animals were electrocuted using AC to prove how dangerous it was. Alternating current was used in the first electric chair, precisely so the public would associate it with death. The message was simple. AC was unstable, unpredictable, deadly. Fear became a tool, but Tesla did not fight fear with words. He fought it with demonstration. In public exhibitions, he allowed electricity to pass through his own body, lighting lamps without wires, showing that AC could be controlled, harnessed, even beautiful. Where Edison showed danger, Tesla showed possibility, and slowly perception began to shift. Then came the turning point, the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. Westinghouse and Tesla won the contract to power the entire event using alternating current. 100,000 lights illuminated the fairgrounds, creating a spectacle the world had never seen. Bright, stable, efficient, undeniable. In that moment, the war was effectively decided. Alternating current was not just viable, it was superior. And the system Tesla had imagined years earlier, alone in his mind, was now powering the modern world. But victory came at a cost. Because while Tesla had won the battle, he had not won the game. At the center of this turning point was his partnership with George Westinghouse. Westinghouse had backed Tesla when no one else would. He had invested in alternating current, taken the financial risk, and helped bring Tesla's ideas into reality. But success came with pressure. Westinghouse's company began facing serious financial strain, competing with established systems, building infrastructure, expanding rapidly. It all added up. And at the heart of it all was a contract with Tesla that promised him royalties for every unit of electricity generated using his patents. A contract that, if honored fully, could have made Tesla incredibly wealthy, but also could have bankrupted Westinghouse. And this is where Tesla made a decision that still feels almost unbelievable. He tore up the contract. Just like that. No legal battle, no negotiation, no attempt to secure his own financial future. He simply gave up the royalties, freeing Westinghouse from the burden and ensuring that alternating current could continue to spread without collapsing under financial pressure. It was an act of loyalty or idealism, or maybe both, but it came at a cost. Because while the system expanded, while cities lit up and industries grew, Tesla did not receive the wealth that should have followed. Others profited, companies expanded. The world moved forward on the foundation he helped build, and Tesla moved on to his next idea. The Niagara Falls power station came next. In 1895, the first large-scale alternating current generating station began producing electricity at Niagara and transmitting it to Buffalo, more than 30 kilometers away, something that would have been impossible with direct current. The modern electrical world had begun. Every outlet in your wall, every phone charger, every appliance, every factory and hospital and subway station, everything runs on the system that Tesla designed in his head decades before the infrastructure to implement it existed. After helping bring electricity to cities across the world, Tesla was not satisfied, because to him, wires were a limitation, a temporary solution, something that solved the problem but did not perfect it. Tesla believed something far more radical. What if energy did not need wires at all? What if electricity could be transmitted through the air freely, instantly, across vast distances, not just to power cities, but to power the entire planet? It sounds futuristic even today, but for Tesla, it was not science fiction, it was inevitable, and he set out to prove it. His experiments began with high-frequency currents and wireless transmission over short distances. He developed the Tesla coil, a device capable of producing dramatic electrical discharges, arcs of lightning that seemed almost theatrical, but served a real purpose. They demonstrated that energy could move through space without direct contact. To most people, it looked like a spectacle. To Tesla, it was a glimpse of the future. And then came his most ambitious project, the Wardenclyffe Tower, a massive structure built on Long Island, designed not just to transmit signals, but to transmit power itself. Tesla envisioned a global system where information and energy could be sent wirelessly across the Earth, reaching anyone, anywhere, free energy, accessible to all. No wires, no limits, no control. And that last part was the problem. Because while Tesla saw a world transformed, investors saw something else, a system that could not be easily monetized. If energy could be sent freely through the air, how would you charge for it? How would you control it? How would you turn it into profit? JP Morgan, one of his main backers, initially supported the project, but once it became clear that Tesla's vision was not just about communication, but about free global energy, the funding stopped. Just like that. Construction slowed, then halted, and eventually the tower was abandoned, left unfinished because the world was not ready. Or maybe the system around him was not willing. The tower was finally demolished in 1917 to pay debts. Tesla saw the symbol of his greatest dream physically disappear, and though he continued working, continued imagining, continued producing ideas that described in terms that only decades later began to seem realizable, the resources and recognition he would have needed to bring them into reality never came. In his later years, Tesla was no longer the celebrated inventor, demonstrating electrical wonders to crowds. He was an aging man, living alone in New York hotels, surviving on small stipends and the fading memory of his achievements. The contrast was almost cruel. Cities glowed with alternating current. Industries expanded, new technologies built on the foundations he had helped lay. And yet Tesla himself struggled to pay for basic necessities. Bills piled up. Hotel managers grew impatient. At times he had to move simply because he could no longer afford to stay. He continued to speak about new inventions, ideas that sounded almost unreal. He described a death ray, a powerful energy weapon that could end wars by making them impossible to fight. He talked about wireless communication systems that resembled what we now recognize as modern radio, and even aspects of global connectivity. But by this point the world was not listening, because without proof, without prototypes, without funding, his words sounded less like vision and more like fantasy. And that is the tragedy, because Tesla had always lived ahead of his time, but now that distance worked against him. The same mind that once seemed brilliant now seemed disconnected. Tesla spent his final years in relative isolation, feeding pigeons in Bryant Park, reflecting on a life filled with both extraordinary success and profound loss. A man who had once stood at the forefront of innovation, now watching the world from a distance. He died on January 7th, 1943. An FBI agent confiscated his papers immediately afterwards, which is a circumstance that has fed decades of speculation about what exactly those documents contained. Most of his work was eventually returned to his nephews and would end up in the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade. The posthumous recognition has been more generous than the contemporary. The unit of magnetic flux density in the international system bears his name, the Tesla unit. His name also appears on the logo of an electric car company, whose founders understood the symbolic value of associating with someone who was simultaneously the father of modern electricity and the person who best illustrates the contradictions between contribution to human progress and the material reward that progress generates. Perhaps the most difficult part of Tesla's story was not the poverty or the obscurity, but the realization that the future he had imagined was arriving, just without him in it. And now we move to a place that existed thousands of years before Rome and that influenced practically everything that would come after. Ancient Egypt, a civilization that lasted 3,000 years, that built monuments that are still mysteriously impressive 4,000 years later, and that had rules about practically everything. If you wake up as a priest in Egypt of the year 1200 before our era, your morning does not begin with a quiet moment of reflection. It begins with a blade, because your first task of the day is to shave. Not your beard, everything, every hair on your body, head, eyebrows, arms, legs. If it exists, it is no longer welcome. Which sounds excessive, and it is, but also has impeccable logic. You are living in a place where the heat is relentless, the dust is everywhere, and the insects are not simply a nuisance. They are ambitious, they are organized. They are completely committed to making you their permanent residence. And hair is prime real estate for parasites. It traps sweat, it collects dirt, it creates a cozy environment where things with too many legs can settle down, raise a family, and ruin your day without asking for permission. So when the priests talk about ritual purity, they are not only talking about pleasing the gods in an abstract sense, they are talking about not becoming a walking apartment complex for creatures that never signed any contract. And suddenly this whole daily shaving situation starts to feel less like an exaggerated spiritual reaction and more like very aggressive pest control, presented in religious language so people comply without questioning it too much. You shave regularly, carefully. There is no "I will skip today because I do not feel like it." There is no "it is just a little stubble." Nothing happens either. Because in this environment, a little stubble is basically an open invitation with catering included. And the worst part is that you have to shave your eyebrows, which means you are now permanently one bad expression away from looking surprised for the rest of your life. But the functionality is clear. Removing hair makes it easier to wash, easier to stay clean, and significantly harder for parasites to find anywhere to hide. It cools your body in a climate that does not forgive, reduces irritation in skin subjected to extreme temperatures and constant dust, and keeps you in a state that, for lack of a better word, is manageable. After shaving, washing, not once a day, not twice, multiple times throughout the day, and not casually, in a structured, repeated way, and taken very seriously, especially if you are a priest, which means your job now includes being both spiritually pure and aggressively clean at all times. You are living next to the Nile, a river that gives life, feeds crops, sustains civilization, and also contains things you absolutely do not want inside your body. Bacteria, parasites, microscopic problems that in ancient times had a very effective way of ending your story prematurely and without prior drama. The Egyptians did not have microscopes, they could not see what was in the water, but they had something equally useful: pattern recognition. They noticed that people who stayed clean stayed healthier, that people who did not tended not to have a good season, and instead of debating it in committees for months, they turned it into a rule. Wash frequently, no excuses, before rituals, before eating, after eating, after walking 5 minutes outside, and simply existing in general under the Egyptian sun, you wash again. Now that you are clean, completely shaved, aggressively washed, you get hungry, which should be simple. You live next to the Nile River. There are fish everywhere, swimming around, practically offering themselves as dinner. Perfect. Except not all of them, because in ancient Egypt, certain fish are strictly off limits, forbidden, not even a just this once situation. More like a do not ask questions, just do not eat it kind of rule, which feels unfair until you think about it for more than 5 seconds. Because here is what those fish are doing all day. They are swimming in a river that also serves as a water source, transportation route, and occasionally a very convenient place for people and animals to dispose of things they do not want to think about anymore. And some fish, they eat that. They eat waste. They eat decaying matter. They eat whatever they find floating or sinking that vaguely resembles food. Which means when you eat those fish, you are not just eating fish, you are eating everything the fish ate. And suddenly this rule stops feeling like a strange religious restriction and starts feeling like the ancient version of maybe do not eat that. It looks suspicious. Cats were everywhere in ancient Egypt, not casually wandering as if they owned the place, though in a functional sense they did, but treated with a formal level of respect that at first glance seems excessive, and at second glance has impeccable economic logic. The rule was simple and absolute. You do not harm a cat, not accidentally, not because it scratched you first, not even in a moment of frustration when it knocked something valuable off for the 3rd time that same day, which, let's be honest, is completely characteristic of cats and has not changed in 4,000 years. Cats were not simply decorative pets in Egyptian society. They were an essential part of the economic survival system. They controlled pests. Rats, mice, snakes, creatures that had a very strong interest in your grain supply. And your grain supply was not just food. It was the entire economy of a civilization that depended on agriculture in an environment where agricultural productivity was limited and fragile. When a cat enters a storage area and casually eliminates a rodent problem, it is not simply being accidentally helpful. It is actively protecting the economic foundation of civilization. And suddenly that apparently exaggerated reaction of treating cats as sacred entities starts to make sense that has nothing mystical and everything practical about it. To reinforce compliance with the rule, they tie it to something even more powerful than economics: religion. Cats are associated with the goddess Bastet, protector of the home, fertility, and cats themselves in a logically perfect circle. Bastet is frequently represented as a woman with a cat head, or directly as a cat. Her temples received donations of bronze cat figures. The sacred cats of her temples were treated with the care we would today reserve for very beloved pets by people with unlimited resources. Harming a cat was not just a practical mistake, it was a spiritual one, which makes people take it much more seriously because people might ignore practical advice, but they rarely ignore divine consequences. At some point during your very clean, very controlled life, you notice something interesting. Everyone is wearing makeup. Not just the wealthy, not just women, everyone. Men, priests, workers. If you have eyes, chances are they are outlined in thick dark lines that make you look like you are permanently ready for a dramatic close-up. And naturally you assume this is about appearance, style, status, looking impressive, which yes, that is part of it, but not the main part. Because that heavy eye makeup called kohl is doing something much more important than making you look mysterious. It is protecting you from the sun. The Egyptian sun is not gentle. It reflects off sand, water, and everything in between, creating a glare that can make it difficult to see and very easy to strain your eyes. That dark kohl around your eyes reduces glare, which means you can actually function without squinting your way through the day. But it does not stop there, because kohl also helps protect against infections. The ingredients, often containing minerals like galena, had mild antibacterial properties, not because the Egyptians fully understood bacteria in the modern sense, but because they observed something very simple. People who used it had fewer eye problems, and eye problems in this environment, dust, sand, wind, constantly trying to irritate your eyes, dry them out, or introduce something unpleasant that could lead to infection, were not a minor inconvenience. So this cosmetic becomes a barrier, a shield, a very stylish, slightly dramatic shield. Of course there is also the religious angle. Eye makeup was associated with protection from evil, often linked to symbols like the Eye of Horus. So now you are not just protecting your vision physically, you are protecting it spiritually, which means this one habit covers multiple layers of Egyptian life, practical, medical, and symbolic. The pharaoh was another rule with consequences very serious for whoever did not respect them. In ancient Egypt, you do not touch the pharaoh at all. Not casually, not respectfully, not even by accident if you can help it. Because the pharaoh is not just a political leader. He is considered divine, a living link between the gods and the people. A physical embodiment of order, balance, and cosmic stability. Which means touching him is not just inappropriate, it is complicated. Religiously, it risks impurity. But beyond religion, there is something else happening here: control. Distance creates authority. The less accessible a ruler is, the more powerful they appear, the more untouchable they seem, the less likely anyone is to forget their position. So this rule is not just about protecting the pharaoh from you, it is about protecting the idea of the pharaoh from everyone. At some point you realize something slightly unsettling. You cannot read. Not because you are incapable, not because you did not try hard enough as a child, but because in ancient Egypt reading and writing are not normal skills. They are privileges, and very controlled ones. Writing hieroglyphs, administrative records, religious texts, is handled by a very specific group of people, the scribes. And scribes are not just people who write things down. They are trained professionals, educated, disciplined, and most importantly trusted. Because whoever controls writing controls records, taxes, laws, history, basically everything that defines how a society functions and remembers itself. Becoming a scribe was one of the few paths of social mobility available in ancient Egypt. A boy of humble origin who managed to enter a scribal school and survive the training process, which was rigorous and could last a decade, emerged in a completely different social category. He avoided the physical labor that was the fate of most of his contemporaries. He had access to resources, to influence, to the possibility of accumulating wealth through administration. The texts Egyptian masters gave to their students have survived, and the tone is surprisingly familiar. Work hard, pay attention. The lazy student ends up doing manual labor. These lessons were written 4,000 years ago, and they sound exactly like something a teacher would say today. The construction of the pyramids, which is the topic that generates the most curiosity in any conversation about ancient Egypt, has an answer that disappoints many people for being completely mundane. Not aliens, not lost technology, not methods impossible to reproduce with human means. The pyramids were built by human workers using methods that modern engineering can fully reproduce and explain. What is extraordinary, genuinely extraordinary, without needing any supernatural complement, is the scale of the logistical organization their construction required. The Great Pyramid of Khufu contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, with an average weight of 2.5 tons each. Some blocks weigh much more. The work was completed in approximately 20 years, which means that on average around 800 blocks were placed per day, or one every 2 minutes if working without stopping. The estimates of the number of workers vary considerably, but modern archaeological research has established that they were paid workers, organized into teams with names, with rotation systems, with access to basic medical attention, with food rations that included bread, beer, and meat. Not slaves, as the persistent popular myth suggests. Workers organized in the most complex system of labor logistics the world had seen to that point. The fact that we can know this, that we can reconstruct the diet of those workers by analyzing animal remains at the construction sites, that we can read the administrative papyri that recorded the rations and the teams and the work shifts, is itself an extraordinary testimony to the sophistication of the civilization that built those structures. Ancient Egypt did not just build pyramids. It developed the administrative systems, the methods of recording, the techniques of massive organization of human and material resources that made it possible to build pyramids. And those systems, that bureaucracy in the best sense of the word, that capacity to coordinate thousands of people toward a common goal for decades, are perhaps the most impressive achievement of the entire enterprise. Egyptian medicine was sophisticated in ways that still surprise modern doctors when they study the texts that have survived. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating from approximately the year 1600 before our era, is one of the most remarkable medical documents that has come down to us from antiquity. It describes 48 clinical cases with a methodology that is recognizably scientific. For each case, the text establishes the title of the case describing the condition, the physical examination to be performed, the diagnosis, the prognosis, and the recommended treatment. There are 3 categories of prognosis: a disease I will treat, a disease I will contend with, and a disease I will not attempt to treat. That last category is particularly revealing. An Egyptian doctor of 1600 before our era was capable of recognizing when a condition was beyond his treatment capabilities, and saying so explicitly, rather than promising results he could not guarantee. That is a form of clinical honesty that in many modern contexts is still difficult to practice. The religion of ancient Egypt is one of the most complex and fascinating theological systems in human history. The pharaoh was not simply a king in the political sense. He was the living embodiment of Horus, the god who maintains cosmic order in the human world. When a pharaoh died, he transformed into Osiris. His successor became Horus. The cycle perpetuated itself. The cosmic order continued. This was not just theology, it was the conceptual structure that legitimized power and made the system work without needing to be questioned in every generation. At the heart of everything in ancient Egypt was Ma'at, the concept of order, balance, harmony. Ma'at is not simply an idea, it is the reason your entire society functions. Without it, things do not just get messy, they collapse. The Nile floods at the wrong time, crops fail, trade breaks down, people stop following rules, authority weakens, and suddenly the carefully structured world in which you live becomes something much less predictable. So every rule you have encountered, however strange it seemed, feeds into this single goal: maintain order, because order keeps everything working. And if everything keeps working, you survive. Simple. Except that maintaining it requires everyone, every single person, to do their part. The priest who shaves every morning, the farmer who tends the fields, the scribe who records the taxes, the pharaoh who performs the rituals. Everyone is part of the system, and the system is everything, and thus 3,000 years of civilization sustained in the valley of the Nile. Not because the Egyptians were especially fortunate or especially gifted, but because they built systems that worked. Systems of irrigation that maximized the agricultural potential of the river. Administrative systems that coordinated resources on a massive scale. Religious systems that gave meaning and structure to the experience of millions of people across dozens of generations. And systems of knowledge, medical, astronomical, mathematical, architectural, that accumulated and were transmitted and refined over time. The Egyptians did not build the pyramids because they had supernatural help. They built them because they had something arguably more impressive, an organizational capacity that turned human effort into permanent stone. And we arrive finally at Greece, because we cannot talk about history without stopping at the place where Western philosophy, democracy, theatre, the Olympics, scientific medicine, history as a discipline, and an extraordinary number of other things we consider fundamental found their recognizable form. If you wake up in Athens of the 5th century before our era, you are in what many historians consider one of the most extraordinary moments in human history. In the space of approximately 50 years between 480 and 430 before our era, the city produced Socrates, Pericles the statesman, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides the dramatist, Herodotus the historian, Phidias the sculptor. The density of intellectual and artistic creativity in that period and in that geographic space is something historians still discuss without having a completely satisfactory explanation. There are theories about the democracy that created space for debate and innovation, about the economic prosperity that financed art and thought, about the competition between city-states that incentivized excellence. Probably all contributed, none explains it completely. Athenian democracy is the obvious starting point, though the version that existed in Athens in the 5th century does not look exactly like what we imagine when we hear that word. Athenian democracy was direct, not representative. Citizens voted personally on laws and political decisions. They did not elect representatives to do it for them. The ecclesia, the assembly of citizens, met on the Pnyx, a hill next to the Acropolis, and any citizen could speak and vote. Meetings were frequent. Decisions were made by simple majority of those present. There was a minimum quorum required for certain especially important decisions, but in general the mechanics were surprisingly straightforward. The problem with this system, which should be obvious, is that only citizens could participate, and in Athens citizen meant adult male of Athenian descent on both parents' sides, which excluded women who were approximately half the free population, slaves who were approximately a third of the total population. The metics, foreign residents who could live in Athens for generations, contribute to the economy and culture, pay taxes, serve in the army, and never have political rights. Athenian democracy was radical and innovative in the context of its time, and deeply exclusive from any perspective of universal participation. This is not a gratuitous anachronistic critique. It is relevant because when we talk about Athenian democracy as the foundation of modern democratic systems, we are making a selection of what to inherit and what not to. Ostracism was a peculiarly democratic and peculiarly brutal Athenian institution. Once a year, citizens had the opportunity to vote to exile someone from the city for 10 years, without judicial process, without formal accusation, without possibility of defense. They simply wrote the name of the person they wanted to exile on a pottery shard, the ostracon, and if a name received enough votes, that person had to leave. The idea behind the system was to protect democracy from individuals who became too powerful or popular as to represent a threat to the system. In practice, ostracism was used against perfectly honourable people who had simply accumulated too much power, or whose political positions were not popular at that particular moment. Themistocles, the strategist who organized the Greek defense against the Persian invasion, and who was largely responsible for the survival of Athens, was eventually ostracized. Aristides, known as the Just for his reputation for extraordinary honesty and integrity, was also ostracized. There is a story, probably apocryphal but delicious, that an illiterate citizen approached Aristides at the voting place and asked him to write the name of Aristides on his ostrakon because he could not write. When Aristides asked what Aristides had done to deserve it, the citizen replied that he did not know but was tired of hearing him called the Just. Aristides wrote his own name without saying who he was. This story may be invented, but it captures something real about how democratic politics works in every era. Socrates is one of the most fascinating figures in intellectual history, precisely because everything we know about him comes from others, mainly Plato, who was his most famous disciple. And Plato had his own philosophical and political agendas that inevitably colored his portrait of the master. Socrates wrote nothing, deliberately nothing, according to the testimonies we have. He believed that writing was inferior to living conversation, because a text cannot answer questions or adapt its argument to its interlocutor. This position is philosophically interesting, though also conveniently impossible to verify, given that he left us no writing of his own with which to check it. What we do know with relative certainty is that Socrates spent his days in the Athenian agora asking people questions. Not casual questions, questions designed to expose the contradictions in the beliefs of his interlocutors. Questions like what is justice, what is courage, what is virtue? Questions that seem simple until you try to answer them with precision. And when the person answered with what they thought was an obvious answer, Socrates asked more questions until the person realized they did not actually have a satisfactory answer, that what they thought they knew was not as solid as they believed. This method, the Socratic maieutic, was deeply disturbing for many people because it made publicly evident that they did not know what they thought they knew. Socrates said the only wisdom he had was knowing that he knew nothing, which sounds humble but in practice was a fairly aggressive way of demonstrating that everyone else also knew nothing, they just did not acknowledge it. It is easy to imagine why this created enemies, especially when the interlocutors exposed as ignorant in front of audiences of curious onlookers were people of position and influence in the city. Eventually he was tried for impiety and corruption of Athenian youth, convicted by majority, and executed by ingestion of hemlock in the year 399, before our era. He was approximately 70 years old. The way he died, according to Plato's account in the Phaedo, is one of the most extraordinary death narratives in philosophical literature. Socrates spends his last day conversing about the immortality of the soul with his disciples, attempting to convince reason that there are grounds to believe that death is not the end. He accepts the hemlock with calm, he comforts those weeping around him, and he dies with the same equanimity with which he apparently lived. What makes the trial and death of Socrates so disturbing is not only the unjust result, it is the fact that it happened in Athens, the democracy, the place that supposedly valued free debate and the exchange of ideas. The Athenian democracy executed one of its most important philosophers for asking uncomfortable questions. It is a permanent reminder that the systems we value contain internal contradictions that they do not always resolve well under pressure. Plato, who witnessed the death of his master as a young man, spent the rest of his philosophical life in part responding to that experience. The Republic, his most famous work, describes an ideal state governed by philosopher kings, people who have achieved knowledge of the ideal forms of things, and who therefore can govern with wisdom rather than self-interest. It is a direct response to the democracy that killed Socrates. If the majority can vote to execute the wisest man in the city, then perhaps the majority should not have the power to make all decisions. This tension between democracy and meritocracy, between the government of all and the government of the most capable, is one of the most persistent tensions in Western political thought. Plato raised it clearly in the 4th century before our era. We are still dealing with it 2,400 years later. Aristotle, who was a disciple of Plato and later tutor of Alexander the Great, is the third figure of that philosophical trio that transformed Western thought. If Socrates was the one who asked questions, and Plato was the one who built ideal philosophical systems, Aristotle was the one who catalogued, classified, and analyzed practically everything that existed. He wrote about logic, about physics, about biology, about ethics, about politics, about rhetoric, about poetics, about astronomy, about meteorology. There is practically no area of knowledge he did not touch. His biology is particularly notable. Aristotle dissected animals. He observed the development of chicken embryos in eggs he opened at different stages of development. He described the anatomy of giant squid with such precision that modern zoologists can identify what species he was describing. He classified animals into categories that in some respects anticipate modern taxonomy. All of this in the 4th century before our era, without microscopes, without laboratories, without any precision instrument beyond his own eyes and his capacity for systematic observation. The Greek theatre is another creation of that period worth understanding on its own terms. The tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were not simply entertainment. They were civic and religious rituals that the entire Athenian community shared. The dramatic festivals, the most important of which was the Great Dionysia in honor of the god Dionysus, lasted several days. Prisoners were temporarily released to be able to attend. Money loans were suspended during the festival period, so debtors could participate without fear of being harassed by creditors. It was an event that had the social importance we would today reserve for a combination of national holiday, major religious ceremony, and first-rate cultural event. The plays performed were not new stories invented by the playwrights. They were variations on myths that the entire audience knew perfectly. No one went to the theatre to discover what happened to Oedipus. Everyone knew that Oedipus would kill his father and marry his mother. The interest was not in the what, but in the how, in how the playwright articulated the meaning of that known story, in what aspects he highlighted, in what questions he explored. Greek theatre invented conventions we still use today. The protagonist, literally the first actor, the antagonist, the chorus that comments on the action, the 3-act structure, the catharsis, the Aristotelian concept that seeing intense emotions represented on stage purges those same emotions in the spectator. When Aristotle describes catharsis in his Poetics, he is doing something we would today recognize as psychological analysis. He is describing why people feel better after watching a tragedy than before. That is behavioral analysis with a sophistication that remains relevant. The ancient Olympic Games, held in Olympia every 4 years in honor of Zeus, are another gift of that civilization to the world. The athletes competed naked, not out of licentiousness but for practical and symbolic reasons. Athletic nudity was an aesthetic ideal representing human physical perfection. The winners received not gold medals but a wreath of olive cut from the sacred tree of Zeus in the sanctuary of Olympia. That wreath had no material value but had enormous symbolic value. The victory in the Olympic Games was not just personal. It was an honor for the athlete's city of origin. Olympic champions returned to their cities as heroes and were treated accordingly. Statues in their honor, lifetime pensions from the public treasury, places of honor at banquets and civic ceremonies. The city that produced Olympic champions gained prestige that had real diplomatic and political consequences in the world of constantly competing Greek city-states. The Olympic truce, the ekacheria, is one of the most remarkable aspects of the game system. During the period of the games, a sacred truce was declared. Athletes and spectators traveling to Olympia had guaranteed safe passage even through enemy territory. The violation of this truce was a sacrilege with serious religious and political consequences. Greeks from different city-states could be at war with each other and still meet at Olympia during the games to compete, rather than fight. It is a sufficiently extraordinary idea that the International Olympic Committee has tried to revive it in the modern context, with mixed results. The pre-Socratic philosophers of Ionia, on the western coast of what is today Turkey, had begun before the great Athenian era. Thales of Miletus, who proposed that the fundamental principle of all things was water. Anaximander, who proposed something more abstract, the unlimited, as the origin of everything. Heraclitus, who saw fire and constant change as the fundamental nature of reality. Parmenides, who argued exactly the opposite, that change is illusory and reality is one and permanent. These philosophers were doing something radically new. They were trying to explain the world in natural terms, without resorting to divine intervention. They were, in a sense, inventing scientific thought by separating the explanation of natural phenomena from mythological narrative. Pythagoras of Samos, whose name you recognize from the right triangle theorem that bears his name, was actually a much more complex and influential figure than the theorem suggests. He founded a kind of philosophical religious community in Croton in southern Italy. His followers had elaborate behavioral rules and metaphysical beliefs. They believed in the transmigration of souls. They had dietary restrictions, and they developed a mathematical vision of the universe that has been extraordinarily influential. The idea that numerical relationships are fundamental to understanding nature, that music can be expressed mathematically, that there is mathematical harmony in the cosmos. These ideas survived historical Pythagoreanism and reappeared in different forms in modern physics. Hypatia of Alexandria, who lived in the 4th and 5th centuries of our era, belongs to the Greek intellectual tradition, though she lived centuries after classical Greece. She was a mathematician, philosopher, astronomer. She taught Neoplatonism and mathematics in Alexandria, the great intellectual city of the late ancient world. She was a pagan in a city that was becoming violently Christian. She was killed by a Christian mob in the year 415. Her death is frequently used as a symbol of the end of ancient science and the beginning of medieval darkness, which is a considerable historical simplification, but that captures something real about the discontinuity in the transmission of knowledge during that period. The Library of Alexandria, which at its peak may have contained between 400 and 700,000 papyrus scrolls, was the largest repository of knowledge in the ancient world. Scrolls from all over the known world, history, philosophy, medicine, mathematics, literature. The official policy of the Ptolemies was to buy or copy any scroll that passed through the port of Alexandria. Ships arriving at the port had to surrender their books to be copied before they were returned or given copies. The accumulation of knowledge was state policy. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria was in reality a gradual process over several centuries of conflicts, neglect, and diminishing resources. Parts of the collection were lost in different violent episodes. Others simply stopped being maintained when resources dried up. The library did not disappear in a day. It faded over generations, and with it, quantities of ancient world knowledge that we will never recover. What survived, what reached the medieval Arab world, then the medieval European world through Arabic translations, what formed the basis of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, is a fraction of what existed. We live in a world built with the fragments that survived the imperfect transmission process. The works of Aeschylus did not survive complete. Only 7 of his 90 tragedies reached us. The same with Sophocles. The pre-Socratic philosophers we know mainly through quotes in other works, not their own texts. What we have is extraordinarily valuable. What we lost is incalculable, and so we reach the end of this night that began in the cold of Viking longhouses, passed through the bustling streets of Rome with their traffic problems and their thermae and their gladiators who did not always die, stopped with an inventor who saw the electric world we inhabit decades before the infrastructure to build it existed, explored the rituals of purity and the sacred cats and the scribes of the Nile, and ended among the philosophers and dramatists and mathematicians who tried to understand the world in natural terms and bequeathed that attempt to all the intellectual traditions that came after. There is something that connects the Vikings with their sagas and their Althing and their extreme pragmatism, with the Romans with their law and their baths and their traffic problems, with Tesla and his vision and his generosity and his solitude, with the Egyptians and their rituals and their ma'at and their pyramids organized with extraordinary logistical precision, with the Greeks and their imperfect democracy and their philosophical questions and their theatre that made entire cities weep. All of them are examples